So my name is Mike Albu. I look after the Beam Exchange, which is a platform for knowledge exchange and learning specifically about market systems development. And we are very privileged today to be hosting this webinar, which we call a Grab the Mic webinar with some people. Well, we're hosting it with some people from the World Bank and USAID, but we were organized with the help of Marketlinks, who is the sort of knowledge platform for the USAID on market systems and inclusive market systems. So it's great to be working in collaboration with Marketlinks. So today we are going to be, we're showcasing the work of the World Bank on some research that they've been doing on how the private sector is adapting to COVID, a country level analysis. So in a minute, I will introduce you to the panelists. Just before I do that, a couple of things. First of all, if you have any questions now or in the course of the webinar, you're very welcome to, in fact, we encourage you please to put your questions in the Q&A box, which you'll find at the bottom, the little icon Q&A, and you can put your questions in there and we will be addressing them later towards the second half of this webinar. The other thing I wanted to say very quickly is if your organization or agency is interested in giving a webinar that's related to market systems development or inclusive markets, this is the place to do it. And we are very happy to entertain any kind of proposal that you might have. You can get in touch with us through the Beam Exchange website and we can talk to you about you running your own Grab the Mic webinar. Anyway, that's probably enough from me for now. I'm going to hand over actually as the moderator for this session today to Devi Ramkissoon from USAID. She's a market systems specialist for USAID, and she's been supervising this research that the World Bank have been commissioned to do, looking at how the private sector is adapting to COVID-19. And she will introduce Marcio and Filip to you. So there we go. Devi, would you like to just take over from me?
Thanks, Mike. And hello and welcome to our Marketlinks and Beam Exchange joint webinar on how the private sector is adapting to COVID-19. Thank you all for joining us today, and thanks to the Beam Exchange for hosting Marketlinks, which is a global platform of nearly 115,000 users that cultivates and shares technical resources on market systems development. The platform is funded by USAID and is open to anyone who is interested in discovering more resources like the ones you'll hear about today, or to share some of your own. I've also included the link to sign up for Marketlinks in the chat box. So without further ado, let's get started on our discussion for today. As we know, market systems development seeks to make markets more competitive, inclusive, and resilient. Times of crisis, such as the COVID-19 pandemic, create new challenges for achieving this goal. In such cases, market development practitioners attempt to understand the new dynamics of the market system in order to pivot and adapt our work accordingly. Having reliable and valid data is crucial to inform key decisions that practitioners, governments, and the private sector need to make. In order to respond to this need, we'll be talking about two separate but interrelated streams of research from the World Bank Group on COVID-19's impact on the private sector. These studies, which were in part funded by USAID, will allow us to determine how to adapt and pivot our programs across the world. What's more, the data collection is ongoing and will be available for all of you to engage with as you design your programs. Our presenters will share the links for their research projects in the chat box soon so that you can access their data at any time. So without further ado, I'm excited to turn to our research teams to share the results of their studies so far. These teams will be represented by Marcio, Cruz, and Filip Jolevski of the World Bank Group. After asking them to guide us through their work, I'll then begin the question and answer session of our discussion. I'll be sharing a few of the questions we've received from our audience members in advance, and also invite all of you to present your questions directly to Marcio and Filip in the Q&A box. So Marcio, to get us started, I'll be looking to you to frame a little bit about your research and briefly describe your methodology for our audience today.
Hi, Dave. Good morning and good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be participating on this seminar. So basically, our initiative can be split in two key exercises. The first exercise is about collecting data across countries. And the second one is about harmonizing this data, analyzing this data. And what we'll be presenting here is based on this analysis we did across 51 countries. And I'll provide also some specific examples for Bangladesh and Kenya. So if you go to the next slide, we can give you a better perspective of how we think about this exercise on the data collection side. So basically, we have developed a new instrument, a survey instrument. And the idea is that we implemented this survey through a rapid phone or online interview. And through the development of this survey questionnaire, we collaborate with several academics and several institutions within and outside the World Bank, including the USAID, who has been funding this activity and has an important participation. The way that we think about this questionnaire is to try to understand the key channels that are affecting businesses. So basically, we think about these channels through the supply side. So for example, the lockdown effect, the supply shock that you have through value chains, for example, but also the impact that you have through the demand shock. And in addition to this, two important channels that we try to analyze are the financial channels and the uncertainty, and you complement this by trying to understand the policy response. For the data collection process, we collaborate with several national statistical offices. And then the next slide can give us a sense of how spread we are through this exercise. So basically, we have completed already the first round of data collection in many countries all across the World Bank regions. We are now starting the implementation of the second round. And then the next slide provides us a bit of the summary of the second part of the exercise, that the analysis of the data. So for this, we have harmonized it so far, data collected across more than 50 countries, representing all the World Bank regions and also countries with different levels of income. And then for this exercise, we combine the business pool survey that has been conducted by our team and also the results from the World Bank Enterprise Survey follow-ups that has been conducted by Filip's team that he will present in more detail soon. And basically, we combine all these results, and also an important point is that we coordinate among ourselves before to make sure that we had the surveys possible to harmonize. And now we analyze the data across some of these key questions. The first one is about the impact on sales and employment. We're trying to understand the impact that COVID has on financial liquidity and survival perspective of the firms. The response to the shocks, for example, if firms are adopting more digital technologies, if they are innovating, the impact on expectation and uncertainty, and also how firms are responding in terms of demanding and governments are responding in terms of policy. We have already the first results out, publicly available for this analysis, and you have some specific topics that now we are covering related to policy interventions, gender, managerial capabilities, technology, and trade.
Great, thanks Marcio for sharing that. So I always find it helpful to think about research methods when applied to specific examples. Would you be able to talk us through how the methodology for your study has been applied to one or two countries?
Sure, thank you, Devi. So let's start first, before I go to, I'll provide some examples for Kenya and Bangladesh, but before I go to these examples, let us just summarize some of the key stylized facts that we found based on the analysis across these 51 countries, right? So the first one is that the shock is deep and persistent. That means that, so for most of the countries, we see that about 90% of firms report that they have a reduction in sales compared to the same period in last year. And this reduction is on average around 50%. So it's very significant. And more important, the drop in sales is persistent even after several weeks after the peak of the shock. For the moment, firms are hanging on to workers. That means that in most countries, you do not see many firms firing workers. They're adjusting in terms of labor by granting leave or reducing hours or reducing wages. Also, firms are adjusting by adopting more digital technology. On average, about 34% of firms reported that they increased the adoption of digital technology for business purpose. But there is a lot of heterogeneity, particularly for low-income countries. Another important point is that there is a lot of uncertainty, and uncertainty is very correlated with labor outcomes. So firms that report that they have more uncertainty are firms that are firing more workers. And finally, we see that there is a limitation on how policies are managed to reach firms, particularly for low-income countries. And in many cases, they are not aware about that. So on this chart on the right side, it shows an interesting results that we found across these countries is that on average, sales are dropping 50% compared to the same period of last year. And for every 50% in drops in sales, we see a correlation with a 4% in drops in employment. So this is an important finding because that means that if you have any policy intervention that could support firms reducing drops in sales or support firms or reducing uncertainty, that also could lead to significant impact in terms of employment. If you go to the next slides, now I will go very quickly through some results related to Kenya and Bangladesh. And my main emphasis here is to emphasize what is different or what is common in these two countries with respect to these common findings in the other countries. So in Kenya, we collected data for more than 2,000 firms. This is a nationally representative data based on the last establishment census provided by the Statistical Office in Kenya. We collected data between June and August 2020. So we see that in terms of sales, Kenya has a very similar behavior. So a large drop on average, the drop on sales was about 50%. Small firms, we observe a drop in sales for small firms that's larger than for medium and large firms. In terms of sector, tourism seems to be the most affected. Now, something that's interesting regarding the results for Kenya is that we do not see that many firms are relying, particularly as as the crisis has been developed, we do not see that many firms are still relying on providing or granting leave of absence or reduction of wages and hours of work. So basically, firms are increasing the response towards firing workers. And that's something that we observe in Kenya, and we do not observe in many other countries so far. So in the next slide, if you go to the discussion about the response. So as I mentioned before, on average, we see that many firms are responding to this crisis by adopting more digital technologies. But we see that in Kenya, on average, firms are responding faster towards the adoption of digital technology than other countries across the world. So we see that about 50% of firms have increased the use of digital platforms or started to use digital platforms for business. And we see that they are also investing now in more digital solutions and changing the product mix. And also about 12% of firms have increased the share of workers from home. So in terms of channels, so we see that the results for Kenya is very similar across countries. That means that at this stage, the crisis is coming from many different channels. So from the demand side, from the supply side, from the financial side, we do not see much heterogeneity here. Much difference across countries and across the way that the channels are playing the important role in the crisis. And then finally, on the next slide, we see an important finding also with respect to expectation and uncertainty. So we ask firms what they're expecting in terms of sales for the next 6 months. And we see that here, firms expect sales to continue to contract sharply in Kenya. And the drop in sales that they are expecting is much higher than the average. So on average, firms are expecting a drop in sales of 26% compared to the same period of last year for the next 6 months. And in addition to this, we also see a lot of uncertainty. But the uncertainty in Kenya is smaller than the rest of the world. What that means? That means that the people in Kenya are expecting that there will be a significant drop in sales in the next 6 months, and there is less uncertainty. They are more convergent towards these results. And then finally, an important finding for Kenya is the fact that 1 in 5 firms in Kenya has received public support during COVID pandemic. So that's also much larger than what we have been found for many other countries, particularly countries with similar level of income. And firms in Nairobi, they have a much higher likelihood of having received this support. And then the next slide, summarizing very quickly the results for Bangladesh. We collect data from 500 farms in Bangladesh in June. We had actually 2 surveys in Bangladesh in different periods, and they are very consistent. Again, in terms of sales, the results are very consistent. On average, 60% of drop in sales compared to the same period. In terms of jobs, here you can see the difference with respect to the way firms in Kenya are responding. So in the case of Bangladesh, the mechanisms that firms are using with respect to the adjustment for labor is much more related to reduction in wages and reduction in hours rather than firing workers. And then in the next slide, to finalize the summary for Bangladesh, another important difference that we see for Bangladesh with respect to other countries is that the response in terms of a digital adjustment is much lower. So we see that in Kenya, about 50% of firms start to use digital platform, and in Bangladesh, this number is around 90%. And then in terms of the other finds, they are relatively similar, but with respect to public support, for example, in Bangladesh, only 2% of firms reported that they received support. So I stop here, and then we can continue with details of the discussions.
Thanks, Marcio, for sharing these 2 country examples with us. I know that a number of our audience members are interested in Bangladesh and Kenya in particular, so that's really helpful to understand the context. Filip, I'd like to turn to you to get a similar understanding of your research as well. Could you, using a country example, share how the scope of your study and your methodology is similar to or different from Marcio's team's approach? And can you also share any surprising conclusions that you gleaned from your data?
Sure, would love to. First of all, let me thank you, Devi and Mike for having us here and hosting us and allowing us to share some of our work. Before I begin, just so the audience has a sense, Marcio and I, even though we work in different teams, our work is very similar. It's coordinated. We've worked before, and just as Marcio said, we've made sure that all of our data collection is similar. We use practically the same methodology. We just have some minor differences that I will go through now. So, and I will discuss a little bit of the survey in Somalia. So if you can go ahead and slide. So in Somalia, the project started way before actually the outbreak of COVID-19, and it's a joint collaboration with the Ministry of Commerce and Industry there, the World Bank, IFC, and UNIDO. My colleague Gemetry is here on the line as well, so he was the person overseeing the entire project. So if there are any questions on the details, he can chime in. But the main difference, I would say, between our approaches is that if you go to go to the next, yeah. So the main difference is that we are a unit that does traditionally data collection and research. So we work less on the operational, and more on an advisory side when for operational units of the World Bank. But so the entire project started last year in 2019 when we were doing we were conducting our regular enterprise surveys for any of you that are familiar with, which is a rather long survey of 300 plus questions that takes about an hour to be completed with top managers. And of course, we expanded the sample to include micro enterprises and as well as a survey on informal businesses, so businesses that are not registered. As you can see, our data collection finished right around March 10, right when COVID was spreading around the world, but before it really had any major impact in Somalia. So just like Marcio said, that this is really the main difference between Marcio's team approach and our approach, which is that basically we have a baseline that we just go back to re-interview them. We did our first follow-up survey in June, where we went back to the firms that we interviewed on the baseline, And because of demand of for some of our partners, we expanded into some other cities. So in that sense, we followed the exact same approach that Marcio's team did for those cities. As you can see, I think Somalia is an interesting country to highlight because it's one country where data is scarce, and it's World Bank considers it as a fragile and conflict-ridden economy. And then the second, it's a case where the COVID pandemic really did not get too much out of control. So the highest, we started the survey right when it was the highest number of cases, active cases, which was about 2,000. I think I checked this morning. I think as of today, they've had only about 4,300 cases. So we're looking at an economy that hasn't been that much directly affected health-wise. So if you go to the next, so we are now ready in mid-November. So in 2 weeks, I think, we're ready to launch, 2 to 3 weeks, ready to launch the second follow-up survey that basically compares these firms over time before the outbreak of the pandemic, and then during the height of it. And now basically we'll see how the situation will develop and the data that we will get. If we go to the next slide, I will talk briefly about the questionnaire. This is something also that our units coordinated. But again, this I will not spend too much time on this questionnaire on this slide, just to showcase that in our baseline, we ask a series of questions that pertain to sales, production, labor, that are very much in details. And now in this follow-up survey, the aim is to get, to conduct a 15-minute interview with the top manager and get just the key aspects, the key implications of how firms have been affected. Okay, so if we can go to the next slide. So the scope of the survey, in some sense, is to get the impact of the shock, right? We're trying to understand temporary closures, supply chains, disruptions. And in some sense, right, the first wave that we're doing now of the survey, it's the results that I'm going to present now, it's this aspect, right? It's right when it happened. So we were trying to understand what actually is going on and how businesses are affected. If you go to the next one, you will see that we're looking at mitigation measures that will be, we are asking in every single wave of the survey, we're asking questions on this, but also, right, our next survey in a sense is trying to focus, okay, we had the initial shock, how are things happening now? How are businesses adjusting? And then the last part is basically when we look, if you go to the next, to look at the effects on the business. So long term, right? And we will have a wave 3 that we will look at long-term effects on businesses in terms of sales, liquidity, and how they recover. But also, right, at every single point in time, we ask these questions to see how they have been affected through this entire process. So you can see this breakdown of a map into for each survey, but also you can consider it similarly for each wave of the survey. Next, I would like to just briefly discuss some of the key highlights that we have found in Somalia. So we can happy to discuss more. I don't want to keep the discussion on the methodology too technical. So I'm just going to go to discuss some of the things that we have observed right now that are somewhat surprising, because we are it's a case of a country that hasn't been really that hit by the health pandemic. But what we are seeing is widespread disruptions, right? Regardless of, even though we are talking about a country that had 4,300 cases, we're seeing widespread disruptions with 45% of businesses closing at some point. And demand and supply reducing by 64% and 71% on both cases. So, and of course that translates into effects for businesses, right? Sales have decreased by 32% and employment has been affected a little less, but still some effects on employment. Now, the really shocking part is that we see significant financial challenges. So a lot of firms are experiencing liquidity shortages and are delaying their payments. Similar things are happening for micro enterprises, except their shock in terms of closures and sales and employment is slightly less, but they have more pervasive liquidity shortages. And so I'm not going to dwell too much into this. Another thing that I'd like to highlight is that maybe perhaps because of the way the health crisis has been developing in Somalia, businesses in the first wave remained somewhat optimistic, with half of the businesses expecting the sales to increase in the next 6 months. And similarly, employment to keep on increasing for the next 6 months. So I think, I don't know if there is interest, but we could do another round and see, basically compare as time goes by, as we collect more data to see how these effects have been how much these expectations have come to a realization or not. I think I will stop here and we can have the discussion so that I don't dwell too much on this, but I think the main takeaways are that if you're using, regardless of whether you're using the surveys, the business pulse surveys or the enterprise survey follow-ups, they're very similar, right? You can draw conclusions for any country. In this case, I think Somalia is an interesting example because data is very scarce there. And we see a country that has been mildly affected by the health crisis, but we see still that businesses are struggling and paying a toll, whether it's through disruptions of supply chains or just shortages of demand that are internally. I shared the link earlier to our survey, so you can access the data there. I'll stop here and we can continue the conversation further on. So.
Great, thanks so much, Filip. That's really helpful. So my question with research always is, what does this mean for all of us? Specifically, what recommendations do you have for development practitioners, governments, or the private sector on how we can adapt our work based on your findings? So Marcio, would you like to start us off on that?
Thanks, Dave. Yes, let us start with learning a bit more from the data, right? Like what the data is telling us with respect to policy interventions. So the first important finding is that when we split countries by income group following the World Bank classifications, we see that firms are not receiving enough support, particularly in low-income countries. Like when you go to the share of firms that report that they receive any kind of support in low-income or lower middle-income countries, we see that is around 13%, which is a share relatively low. The second important finding is that when we ask about what sort of policy instruments firms are receiving, we see that there are some important differences with respect to across income groups. So basically, when you go to low-income countries, you see that the most common policy instruments that firms have been reported that they receive is tax reduction and deferrals. While as you move upper in the income level and you go to upper middle income and high income countries, you see that firms are much more likely to receive wage subsidies. So this is an important point because it tells us also what's going on in terms of the constraints that these countries are facing. So higher income countries, usually they do have more budget in order to provide grant, in order to provide subsidies that is more in the form of a kind of a monetary direct subsidies for firms, while that's not the reality to low and low middle income countries. And then in the next slide, an important finding as well is that when we ask for those firms that report that they did not receive any support, we ask them why they did not receive any support. We see that there's a very large share of firms reporting that they are not aware about these interventions. So, and this is also negatively correlated with income. So as you go, for example, to low income countries, you see that about 70% of firms are reporting that they are not aware. And if you go to high income countries, a very small share of firms are reporting that they are not aware. So very quickly, some key consequences from these findings when you think about policy instruments. The first one is about the fact that we need to do a better job, particularly in lower income countries, in let firms know that these interventions, these policy instruments are in place and are available. So the fact that the firms are not aware, that means that sometimes government are making efforts in order to come up with new instruments, or donors are making this effort. But if firms do not know about that, then that may lead to a huge bias towards who are those that receive this policy. It's much more likely that those that are more connected, for example, will receive this policy, and that does not mean that those should be the main target. So another important point is that when you think about this topic, basically there are two main issues that policymakers need to decide. That's about what instrument to use and what are the targets, right? So we see, based on the previous slide I showed, is that many of the instruments in low-income countries are usually more constrained towards many of these instruments. So that means that when they go for, or even like donors, to options such as providing grant to firms, so far and so on, we need to try to develop a much more sophisticated mechanism towards filtering those firms. And our analysis also shows that very basic observable characteristics, for example, the sector of the firm or the size of the firm, usually are not very good variables for targeting, because that means that even within like a small firms in the same sector, there is a huge variety. So one important suggestion that we have been giving to governments is that we should thinking about like mechanism of funneling and filtering these firms through, for example, different stages. For example, you could come up with an intervention in which in the first stage, you achieve a lot of firms. And as firms show more commitment, you can go to the next stage in which you provide more support. A typical example would be for providing digital support, for example. You could come up with an intervention that's much broader and relatively cheap to achieve a lot of firms. And then as firms show commitment, you should engage them and consider it to provide other instruments. Thank you, Devi.
Thanks, Marcio. Filip, how about you? Do you have any recommendations for us?
So yes, so one of the things that we looked at is we asked firms, what type of support would help businesses navigate the crisis the most. So we are still working a lot on in terms of research to find out which ones have been the most effective, but at least getting a sense of what businesses have been citing as the most beneficial for them. So these results here are shown for small, medium, and large firms. So for firms that are bigger than 5 or more employees. And it seems that some type of flexibility for their operation seems to be the key, right? So the deferral of rent or mortgage or utility payments or the deferral of tax payments seems to be the key in terms of to deal with some of the liquidity shortage that we saw earlier, right? In the results where we saw that about 90% of firms have been affected. Access to new credits comes in third, right after these two that are somewhat of adjustability, somewhat of a more flexible adjustability support or interventions. If you go to the next slide, we have the numbers for micro enterprises in Mogadishu. Again, the deferral of rent and mortgages is also seems to be the one that's the most cited, with nearly half of the businesses. But here we see that cash transfers for smaller firms seems to be more helpful for them. So even though these are not specific policies, and I think Marcio and Dennis are more positioned, since they are more on the operational side of the World Bank. They can talk more, I think, more informatively on specific policy recommendations or programs that can be done. We are basically trying to see what the respondents are saying, what businesses are saying, and trying to this can be used to inform policymaking further on. So.
Great. Thanks to both of you for sharing those recommendations with us. So we'll now move into the Q&A portion of our discussion. And to our audience members, you can feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A box, but I'd like to get us started by asking both of you a few of the questions that we've received in advance. As you can imagine, we received quite a few questions on how the private sector what their coping strategies are during COVID-19. Can you both share your thoughts on how companies should change their business practices to survive, and whether they can turn the pandemic into an opportunity for further growth? Are there any specific innovative practices that you can highlight? And that's open to both of you.
Thank you, Devi. Perhaps I can start, Filip. And I also like to invite Dennis Medvedev and Ana Goicoechea. Dennis is our practice manager in our team, and Ana Goicoechea is a senior economist in our team as well. So please step in to complement my answers. So I do think that every crisis provides also opportunities, and I see that something that's very likely, and we are seeing this in the data, is that firms are moving faster on the process of adoption of digital technologies. And that, I think, there will be that will lead to some important consequences that will stay even after COVID. As we're doing like the seminar here, we are seeing that people are adjusting and comparing. For example, we have done some surveys on adoption of technology and digital technologies pre-COVID, and we can see with these numbers that the share of firms that are moving towards adopting digital technologies, for example, are very significant. In terms of innovation, that's another area, for example, that firms are reporting that they are changing their product mix. Now, what's important about the findings that we get from the data is that usually firms that are adopting, that are changing their product mix, or that means that they are innovating more towards the crisis, are also firms that are reacting towards many other channels. So basically, these things are very correlated. So basically, we're not seeing that the crisis now are making firms that were not very prepared for a crisis like this to suddenly start to react better. So our hypothesis is that this is very likely related with the fact that these firms have better managers, so far and so on. That's something that we start to investigate now. But that also leads to another opportunity that I think that we have in terms of policy interventions is that you could use this moment in order to provide, for example, managerial training. There are a lot of evidence out there suggesting that this may explain significantly the difference in terms of productivity of firms across the world, across countries and within countries. And I do believe that that could be an opportunity for firms, but also an opportunity for policymakers in order to think on how to react towards this crisis.
Yes, so similar to what Marcio said, some of the things that we have been observing, right? I mean, whether on the question on whether some businesses can turn this into an opportunity, of course, that's something that that businesses we've seen that some businesses are growing. That's something that we've seen, that some firms have managed to adapt and to changing circumstances. Of course, any change in circumstances provides an opportunity for businesses to turn around. But similar to Marcio's findings, we see in our results, it seems that it's something intrinsic. So firms that are innovating, right? And I know that I saw some questions. I think there are a lot of questions coming in, but I saw some questions, on technology adoption, what specifically it is. So and we measure multiple things, including increase of remote work, remote sales, but one thing that has been seen, which kind of points to the same direction that Marcio was talking about. One thing that we have seen, that firms that were innovators in the baseline, so whether they introduced a new process of innovation or a new product of innovation, they're more likely to adapt across different measures, and they're less likely to have a big impact, or to have they're more likely to have a positive impact after this shock. So in some sense, it's very similar to what Marcio's point. Same from our observations.
Yeah, thank you. That's really interesting, and in particular, what you said about the use of online platforms and remote work. I think it is really an interesting finding that we're all experiencing and living through today as well. Marcio, just on that point, we did receive quite a few questions related to digital solutions more specifically. What did your study reveal about how companies are adopting digital solutions to maintain operations despite social distancing norms? And what are some of the challenges and opportunities associated with moving to digital platforms?
Thank you, Devi. So to answer this question, I'll combine the results that we're having from the Business Pulse survey with this previous survey that we have done in several countries, including Bangladesh, on adoption of technology. And what we found in this previous survey, in the case of Bangladesh, was we conducted the survey right before COVID. And we see that when you go to a very advanced firm, and then you ask, okay, what are the sort of digital technology that is advanced firm is using that a very like a small firm is not using? And then to answer this question, let us split the way that they use these digital technologies in tasks. For example, are they using digital technologies for business administration? Are they using digital technologies for sales, for payment, so far and so on? What our work shows us is that very advanced firms, they are using much more advanced digital technologies like ERP systems for business administration. And small firms are not using that before COVID. But when you go to the adoption of digital technologies with respect to functions such as payment and sales, there is no much difference between small firms, large firms, very sophisticated firms, and less sophisticated firms. One potential hypothesis for that is that this adoption of technologies in functions that involves interaction depends not only on the capacity of the firm, but also on the capacity of the customers, of the capacity of the suppliers in adopt the same technology. So what I do think that this crisis may lead in terms of opportunity for digital technology is that it will increase the adoption of technology for customers. When you think about Kenya, for example, we see that a lot of households a lot of people start to use digital technology to buy their goods. And that can lead to an important opportunity for firms. So we have some questions about on what are they using, in particular digital technologies. The sort of tests that are usually the easiest one for adopting are those related to sales and payment. These are usually the most straightforward. The other tasks usually requires much more capabilities from the side of the firm.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Marcio. We also received quite a few questions on gender-related issues that are influencing adaptation to COVID-19. As we might guess, there are some differences between female-led and male-led firms and how they can adapt some of the practices that you've been describing. Filip, I think that your survey actually had some really interesting insights into this particular topic. Could you talk about how or whether there's a difference in the coping behaviors of female-led and male-led firms? And is there any evidence that COVID policy responses have been informed by gender and social inclusion considerations?
Yeah, so thank you, and I want to also thank, I see Natalie and Angelica asked these questions. So had I known the interest on gender would have been so big, I would have included a slide on this. So just to say, what I'm going to say is going to be some research that we're working on together with some colleagues that is very preliminary. So, but some of the things that we're observing is that, for example, the percentage of firms that have ceased operations. The percentage of female firms that have ceased operations is lower than the percentage of firms of male managed firms that have ceased operations. In a sense, we're seeing that female managed firms are dying less in many countries, not all, but in several countries. We see this trend. This is surprising to us. We're still trying to answer, why this is or what's going on. It's surprising to us because we've done a similar analysis. So we did the similar type of surveys back in 2010-11 with the financial crisis. So we had a baseline in 2009 with, and in the financial crisis, female managed firms were more affected. That was one thing that we saw. female workers were more affected. We do have a lot of questions on how female employment is affected. That is ongoing research that we are engaged with. And I wish I could have more results to share on that. But unfortunately, specifically on female employment, I don't at the moment. Our indicators and data are available online. So all the data is available there in terms of how many female workers have been laid off, how many female workers had to take leave due to COVID. And yeah, but on management, these results that we're finding are very interesting. So we're trying to tease out to make sure, it's not some story that's due to sorting, right? Because female managed businesses, female managers in some countries are sorted in specific sectors. So we're trying to control for that. And another thing that we're observing that's also somewhat surprising is that female managed firms are less likely to reduce their number of employees. So in a sense, even though the difference between the impact on sales is it's not that different between male managed and female managed firms. Female-led businesses seem to be retaining more employees than percentage-wise than male managed firms. So that's an interesting, again, like I said, these are just preliminary results. We're trying to tease out why this is happening and to make sure that there's not something else influencing the result. I think there are strains of literature that looks at specifically in terms of especially in countries where women are disadvantaged, that if they reach to a leadership position, to a management, it could say something about the ownership and the board of the firm, that it's more inclusive and more open. So the work culture is something that allows them to perform better. It could be also that to reach to the level of leadership in a place, for example, where there's some cost involved with it, whether it's some form of sexism, that you have to have a lot better skill sets to get there. So there are still many things that we're trying to explore, but these are some top line results that we're seeing, that we're finding surprising in a positive way, right? That we see less of female businesses exiting, and we see female-led businesses, and that we see that they're less likely to reduce employment. So I hope that answers some of the questions that were out there. I know there's one on women-owned. That is also we're looking to that, but I don't have the results with me right now to be able to share on that. So.
Thank you, Filip. And as you're speaking, and Marcio as well, I can see that there are quite a number of questions that are coming in real time as well. I believe Mike has been diligently tracking the questions for us. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Mike. Would you like to share some of the questions that our audience is presenting right now?
Devi, could I just add on gender?
Yeah, Dennis, go ahead.
Sure, please.
Oh, sorry, Mike. So very, very quickly, just a couple of things more to add on gender to sort of, I think, balance the optimistic picture that Filip has presented, which of course gives us a lot of room for optimism. But we also are seeing some negative implications of the crisis. So particularly when we look at small businesses, we do find across countries that female-led businesses, or businesses that employ a higher share of women. So again, there are different ways of looking at the impact of this crisis for women. We can look at female-owned versus male-owned firms, but we can also look at firms that sort of have a large number of women on the payroll, and those two are not the same, right? But regardless of the definition, we do see that particularly for small businesses, the gender impact is stronger. So female-led businesses or businesses that hire a lot of women, especially when they're small, tend to suffer larger declines in sales. And that's, interestingly enough, particularly true for some hard-hit sectors like hospitality. So even though we already know that women are more likely to be employed in sectors such as accommodation or food services, even controlling for that, we still see disproportionate impact on women. So it does seem to be hitting on the sales side, women-owned businesses harder. Also, again, for small businesses, we are seeing less access to public support. So women-owned businesses seem to be receiving public support a bit less than male-owned businesses. And again, that's a bit of a cause for concern. Thanks.
Thanks, Dennis.
Yeah, thank you, Dennis. So maybe carrying on in a similar vein, there's a cluster of questions coming in about informal and unregistered businesses. P. Thomas from Somalia was interested in why micro-enterprises appear to be nimbler in response to the shock. Given you'd imagine that their liquidity difficulties would be more intense. So that's one sort of question for you to speculate on. But perhaps more importantly, what are the policy instruments that governments should be considering to support informal or unregistered enterprises? Because I mean, then these are not typically firms that are paying a lot of tax, or it's not obvious ways to sort of relieve the pressure of formal regimes on them. So what might governments do to support the informal and unregistered sectors?
Thanks, Mike, and thanks. I think Thomas. I was going to answer some of these questions on that were coming in, but between talking and typing, that takes time. So my colleague Gemitch is also on the line. So Gemitch, if you have something to add, feel free. But let me start with the informal. So some of the so we conducted the survey right on informal businesses right before the crisis, and because our methodology is specifically targeting, trying to go to specific areas and then talk to the businesses on the street, right? The biggest challenge with informal businesses, whether it's to help them or to study them, is that there is no listing of them. There's no registrar, right? Even now, if you want to design a program to specifically help them, right, it's very difficult to find a listing that how you can find them and how you can help them, right? Actually, some of Gemitch and I have done some work on this that looks at that it's a big share of the economy in many places, right? It's a big share of employment in many environments, including Somalia. Unfortunately, we weren't able to conduct a follow-up survey there, because one of the things that when we were collecting the information, we were going to markets, on the streets, to houses, and a lot of these people are moving around, and because the survey needs to be fast, it takes a long time, and we don't, because of the nature that they're also informal, not registered, we do not want to collect any personal information or contact information for that reason. I think now we are trying to change that so that we could be able to study them, exactly how they have been affected. But I think one thing that we have been seeing that's spread throughout, we have been trying to see adoption of different technologies, and that the informal business uses for their operations. And one thing that seems to be quite prevalent is mobile money. And I think that's a potential avenue for even support or having some type of access to these businesses that are using mobile money. Of course, that means that we're excluding those that do not, which in some countries it's quite large. But generally we see mobile money that as one way. Specifically, what can be done to support these businesses? It's a very difficult question. I think I mean, there are some ideas out there. I'm sure some of my colleagues can chime in, but I think the bigger concern is how to get to them, right? How to reach them, because that is the difficulty with anything from serving the informal business, and now serving informal businesses to contacting them. And the challenges now with restrictions on movement or health concerns, that makes it very difficult, right? Even for businesses for many of these informal businesses to operate, and for us to be able to reach them. On micro firms, I don't know if Gemitch wants to chime in, but I think one of the things that we think that makes them more nimbler is that these businesses have smaller sunk costs in relative, and they are more flexible in terms of operations. So they may not have an office; they may be operating from home, that sell on a stand, and many of them tend to be they're engaged in type of necessity. So if it's a one-person employment, that it may be a secondary form of a business. So it remains a lot. There are many things that we still need to explore, and we are exploring to be able to give a more concrete answer to that. But those are our initial hypothesis, how to say.
Sorry, Mike, if I may, just to complement, one of the challenges that we have in terms of informality, particularly when you go to low-income countries or middle-income countries, is the definition as well, right? Like, let's give an example in Senegal. So in Senegal, when you think about informal firms, there are like this group of firms that Filip is mentioning, that basically there is no registry. Although in the case of Senegal, there is a census from the statistical office that allow us to reach those firms. And then there are also like a internal definition of formality by the government, depending on, for example, how they have their accounting systems. So this is important because if we're thinking about informal firms, following simply like the idea of the formal concept, administrative concept, but we are still thinking about firms that have more than 5 employees, they produce, etc. Then I think the main challenge is how to reach them. But the way to think about intervention is not that different from other firms, except with the fact that the tax reduction for them may not be an option. Now, when you think about the micro firms that are out of the picture, basically it's really hard to reach them and are informal. Usually the way that we have been thinking in terms of intervention is to basically focus on the idea of providing income as we think about individuals. So rather than thinking about the firm perspective, we think about the individual perspective and the challenge that they're facing from the income side. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcio. Again, since you've joined us, did you want to add anything from the Somalia perspective?
Thanks, Mike. I really don't have much to add, but I just wanted to point out one quick thing on micro. As Filip mentioned, we really don't have a lot of data to make a firm conclusion as to why micro is nimbler. So essentially what we're really putting forth is a hypothesis. So as Filip was saying, so what we know from the micro enterprise surveys that we conducted before the COVID, what we know is most of these business, almost all of these business are really services, selling food, clothes and stuff. And they are mostly operated from within the residential neighborhood. So basically the mom and pop shop, somebody selling stuff from the kiosk of their houses. So that makes these guys nimble in the sense that when the business closure was enforced, these guys can easily operate from their house. So essentially without closing their business. And also the type of business they engage, selling food, they're basically catering to necessities. They will still have buyers, and their business may not be affected that much. So that's why we see actually this type of business sustain a relatively smaller decline in sales compared to the larger firms, whereas we see about 30% decline in sales for larger firms. For these guys, we saw a 17% decline. But on the other hand, these guys, the micro enterprises, have a limited resource, which means that a small shock would really put them at a difficult position. So that's why we see, while the sustained limited smaller decline in sales, you see a pervasive problem in terms of liquidity. So we hope to capture a lot of information in this regard on the next survey that we're planning in mid-November. Hopefully we'll have much more to say on that. So that's all I want to add at this point.
Okay, many thanks, Marcio. Just to recap, everybody, there is a link in the chat box on the right from Filip just now with a link to the World Bank's survey page where all the data is accessible, and also the report that was mentioned earlier can be found through that website. I posted a link to it. Oh, there it is from Marcio. So please do follow up, and this is ongoing work, so the data will keep on coming in. We have amazingly rushed through that hour very, very fast. The time just flew by, I'm afraid, so we've now run out of time. But I hope you found it interesting. It's certainly been great to hear these people talking about both the methodologies of doing this very tricky data gathering, and also the implications that they're seeing from the data coming through. Sorry, we didn't have time to answer a lot of questions, a lot of interesting questions that came in the registration process, but you can contact us. You can go on the Beam Exchange LinkedIn group and post further questions there, which we may be able to answer. So we will try and carry on the conversation as best as possible. And of course, you can reach these people through their website. So it serves to me just to thank Devi for moderating, and Marcio and Filip and Dennis and Gamechi for speaking on this subject. And before you leave, may I ask you all the attendees, that is, just to give us some feedback on the event by clicking on the link that has also appeared in the chat box a moment ago. A short webinar survey, it says. Just let us know what you thought. That would be really helpful. And as I say, if you have any interest in presenting your own work, your own agency's or organization's work, this is, please contact us at the Beam Exchange or indeed contact people at Marketlinks, and I'm sure we can look at any proposals that you have. Devi, would you like to say a final word?
Oh, thanks so much, Mike. I just wanted to say thank you to the Beam Exchange for this collaboration, especially also to our World Bank research teams for making their data accessible to all of us. And last but not least, to all of our audience members for making the time to join us today. I hope that the research that you've all heard today will help you in making the decisions that you need to make in the coming months. And we'd also love to hear from all of you on Marketlinks as well. So thanks so much.